Hello and welcome to another Plain Truth, and this week we're going to be talking about braking and contaminated runways. Joining me as always is the legend that is Captain Al. Hi Captain Al.
Hello there, how are we?
Yes, very good, thank you, very good. Listen, this could be the shortest Plain Truth yet, as I asked the question essentially, does an aeroplane basically have ABS? Is what I'm asking.
Anti-lock brakes? Yes, they do.
Okay, all right.
Because in exactly the same way as in your car or in your bus, if the wheels are skidding, then they are not braking. You are effectively just a set of ice skates, if you like, just skidding along the surface. So a skidding wheel will not slow the aeroplane, the car, or the bus down.
No, indeed. Now, obviously, I said in the title there about contaminated runways, and what I mean by that is obviously what sort of impact does that have with wet runways, for example. I mean, I know certainly in the larger airports they do their best to de-ice runways, but obviously you can only be so effective, I guess, at making sure that the runway isn't iced up, for example, especially in some of the more colder countries. So, I mean, what procedures are in place to sort of help you in those sort of incidents?
Okay, well, if we think about an aeroplane when it's on the ground, it's no different to any other motor vehicle, if you like. So when the road or the runway is wet, the braking capability is reduced. It's exactly the same in our car. We know that our stopping distance in a car is significantly greater when it's wet than when it's dry. You being a professional motorist will be able to quote chapter and verse on how many percentage at 30 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour, etc., etc. Don't bother, we don't need to. It's just a simple fact that that we know from experience. And if you're driving on snow or ice, we know that it's going to take a lot longer to stop. It's exactly the same on the aeroplane, because at the end of the day, it's just wheels going round and around with brakes. We do use the reverse thrust on the aeroplane to
I was going to ask
stopping.
That actually, yeah.
Reverse thrust is only really effective above sort of 70 knots, 100 miles an hour. So the first part of the slowdown phase, reverse thrust is very effective. As we slow down, it becomes less and less effective, and that's where we tend to use the brakes more and more. So yes, we have anti-lock brakes for exactly the same reason you would want to have them on your car. So if we can stop the wheel skidding, even though we have to release the brake pressure to do that, so as we've seen skid marks on roads where ABS is kicked in, you've got a little bit of a skid, the brakes are released, the wheel spins up again, and then the brakes are put on. And the scientists have worked out that if we release the brake pressure and then put it back on, the overall stopping distance is less. And we appreciate that. And that's exactly the same way as it works on an aircraft. So when we have wet runways, we need a greater distance to stop than we would do on a dry runway. So we can't say to the airport, okay, well, it's raining, so can you go and build me an extra 100 meters of runway, please? We have to look at it the other way and say, okay, what is the maximum amount of weight that we can have on the aeroplane when the conditions are dry, wet, etc.? So that's how we look at it. We look at our landing weight. So that can be built up over a number of factors: the actual empty weight of the airplane, how much fuel we've got on board, passenger weight, cargo, etc., etc. And that's something that we can control. So when we look to do the calculations, we're working out what the maximum landing weight is for the given environmental conditions: the temperature, the wind, the runway surface, etc., etc., how high the airport is. So as the condition of the runway deteriorates, function of what level of contamination is contained on the runway, so our landing distance increases, so therefore our weight has to decrease because we can't build or extend the runway. So this gets quite complicated, where we start to have to look at things like how much contaminant there is on the runway. So is there more than 3 millimeters of contaminant? If it is, then if it's over a reasonable amount of the runway, so 25% of the runway, then we have to look at contaminated runway figures, and then we look to see whether it's water, slush, snow, wet snow, dry snow, or is it just ice? So the runway is then broken down into various categories, and these have recently been standardized across the world. So we're now starting to use the same song sheet around the world, because previously different countries had their own way of measuring this. And therefore we apply an appropriate strategy. Now, you would say, okay, right, well, it snowed, let's clear the snow off the runway. Brilliant, fantastic. And that's what happens in most places. In the UK, if it snows, we have snow plows out, snow blowers, off we go, close the airport, clear the snow, reopen the airport, aircraft carries on. One of the problems that we have in the UK, because we quite often have utter chaos and carnage when it snows,
Yes.
is that our snow tends to be quite slushy, and slush really, really isn't great. As we know from our car, if we're just driving on fresh powdery snow, it goes nicely crunch underneath us, and it's actually not too bad to drive on. But slush is just awful, because you've got a combination of water, ice, and snow, and you just don't know what you've got. And that's what we tend to have. In countries like Finland, for example, where it's just very, very cold all the year round and it snows a bit, there is no point in trying to get rid of the snow, because it's just a daily feature of life.
Yeah.
So what they tend to do is they tend to have snow-covered runways. They don't try to clear it, but what they do is they will cover the compacted layer of that snow with grit. And grit is brilliant for braking on. So perversely, you could have a flight where you've got just, an average dumping of UK snow, and it's all slushy and really not very nice, and then go to Finland where you're knee-deep in snow, but it's all nicely compacted. They've covered the runway with grit, and it's lovely. It's just like landing on sandpaper.
Wow. And so, I mean, I've heard I know they do it slightly off topic, but sort of like football pitches and things like that, where it's like the underneath is heated. I mean, is that something where they do like heated runways, or would that just be a ridiculous question?
It's a really good question, actually. And I vaguely remember that someone did experiment with this, but one of the problems with tarmac is that if you heat it up, it tends to melt. Yes.
Yes, good point. Yes, good point. Well made. Yeah.
But what they do is they will anti-ice a runway. So in the same way as you might sort of like put a ice preventative treatment on your car in the evening to stop ice forming on it overnight, they can do that to runways. So they kind of pre-treat it with a liquid that basically stops ice forming on the runway, because in exactly the same way as anything else, you can get a frosty covering of a runway. That can be a bit messy. And obviously what you don't want is ice, because ice is really slippy, funnily enough.
Yeah, yes, by sheer definition. Well, as always, Al, a very complicated subject, simplified to perfection. Thank you, as always.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
If you'd like to watch more from our great series, then you can do that by pressing here. We've also created you a playlist with all the Plain Truth episodes, and you'll find that just here. Why not like and subscribe to our channel? That way you will be notified whenever we post our great content. Or if you've got a question that you'd like Captain Al to answer, then why not pop it in the comments box below, and you may well feature on an upcoming episode of The Plain Truth.